The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books podcast. According to her detractors, Angela Nagle is an old leftist's idea of what a young leftist should be. But her champions call her one of the brightest lights in a new generation of left-writers who have declared independence from intellectual conformity. We at Zero Books are proud to have published her book, Kill All Normies, and we're glad to welcome her back as a guest on this week's podcast. It's Wednesday, October 4th, 2017, and I'm Douglas Lane, the publisher of Zero Books and the host of this podcast. If you're a current member of the Zero Books Club, I want to thank you, and I want to let you know that we'll be moving from the Zero Books blog to Patreon. We're doing this to make it easier to get the members-only podcast inside Zero Books. When you sign up for Patreon and let them host your site, each individual member will get his own RSS feed, which he can then use to catch the podcast on his favorite pod-catching device, like an iPod or an iPhone or an Android phone or a Zune or whatever it is. I don't even know how many devices there are. There are too many devices. Current members of the Zero Books Club will receive a complimentary copy of a Zero Books title chosen at random as a parting gift. But you don't have to re-sign up at Patreon to get this book. We're just going to be sending you all a book. There's about 80 of you, and you're going to get copies of books. So if you want them. And an email will be coming your way soon about that. The music you're listening to right now is the theme from Shaft. But in just a moment, you'll be listening to Angela Nagle answer her critics. Back in the 70s, a French radical named Guy Debord produced a film called Refutation of All Judgments, which responded to all the critics of his first film, Society of the Spectacle. After the reaction to your book, I want to write a book called Corrections of All Misreadings, just for you, about Kill All Normies. What seems to have happened after the publication of your book is that a few talking points based on what looked like to me purposeful misreadings of your book. That's not very charitable of me, but it may have been a mistake. Anyway, these purposeful or non-purposeful misreadings were passed around on Twitter and then refined by a few well-placed academics, and then they started turning up in a few reviews. And it's made me fairly worried, not about Kill All Normies, which is selling very well, and not for you, because I think you're going to continue to write and produce really good work, although I think this might have some negative impact on you in ways we'll discuss, but just for the left.
I'm sure I've missed lots of reviews, and after a certain point, I was really just, I'd look at the kind of first paragraph, and that would be it. I'd kind of get an idea of where it was going at that point. But, obviously I'm going to say this, right, defensively, but I honestly think it's true. The kind of, just intellectually, the standard of thought and was so low. They would say, I've spotted something that isn't a left-wing thought, okay? This is like this hilarious thing that really amuses me. They're like, what they're really annoyed at, though, right? Like a friend said to me, and I think it's very true, if I had written the same book with a mainstream publisher and just written for mainstream magazines and never written for Jacobin or never suggested in any way that I was part of the left, they would have probably barely noticed the book. They have to show this is our group and this person isn't allowed in the group because I've shown that that there's a wrong thought in here, and it's wrong because it's not what I'm going to call a left-wing thought. I don't go around looking at sort of the world and going, how can I have a left-wing opinion on this? Like, what is the left-wing position on this? I mean, first of all, left-wing is sort of like, but, I'm happy to draw ideas from, art critics, from indeed conservative thinkers where I think there's a good idea there. I read very widely. I've always kind of made an effort to, when I see someone who's making an intelligent counter argument to me, not just an internet nonsense one, I'll actually go out of my way to read everything that person has written. That's how I spend all my time. I mean, this is what I've been doing for, 15 years or something like that. Just like obsessively reading the stuff that's difficult and that challenges me. Part of it, of the practice of doing that, is trying to get closer to the truth, trying to understand the world, and that's my main focus.
The function of the reviews that have been popping up in these different little small online journals and magazines that are, define themselves, say, as far left or socialist, has been to protect their identity, and to define an insider and define an outsider. It has not been to understand the book.
If they were to apply sort of Marxist thinking to what they're doing, they wouldn't be able to just kind of run after every little like internet fashion that's sort of blowing in the wind that week, which is, in my experience, what kind of trots have a tendency to do. They go along with whatever is in fashion at the time, and there's no intellectual consistency in any of it, as far as I can tell. I mean, what they're chasing right now, if this is like anything to go by, this stuff, is just this eccentric kind of radical liberalism. It has no connection to Marxism whatsoever. I mean, just to give a particular example, there was one hilarious review, which was in Red Wedge. One of the funny lines in it was like, Nagle would like to imagine a left that is, what was the phrase? Nagle would like a left that was led by able-bodied workers, something like that.
If it were up to Nagle, the left would be led by able-bodied workers who, if they come from any marginalized group, take pains to not make that the focus of their politics. That's the quote that you were looking for.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, just think about this quote for a second. You cannot have understood a word of Marx and be able to write something that stupid. Like, that is not even remotely connected to the ideas of Marxism. Marx did not pick the working class because they were some pitied group that, you could kind of use to like morally exalt yourself through, right? He picked the working class because the nature of how the economy was changing through industrialization and so on indicated that class was going to get so big that it would be that if it organized, it would be this new massive historical force. That's why the working class are important. It's not because like they are marginal and suffer, and therefore they have some kind of a moral usefulness or something like that. A workers' movement is going to be led by able-bodied workers. I mean, right. How can you even talk to somebody who's like, who just has so little grasp of the basics of Marxism, that's kind of the nature of their argument. You would have to, there are so many layers of subcultural weirdness and value judgments and misunderstandings that you would have to get through to even begin the conversation. That isn't Marxism. That's a weird amalgamation of radical liberalism, and a kind of noblesse oblige, maybe more like it, or something like that. It's this idea that like you have to find these small groups of people that you can help, and you have to,
Right.
and that the reason that they're important is because their suffering gives them a moral significance.
I think what's important to understand, sort of underline, is that the history of Marxism is the history of the abandonment of Marxist ideas. It's certainly in the last, say, 50 years or so, that there's this thing called post-Marxism, which is largely about picking up other theorists and calling them Marxist. So, you talk to a group of Marxists, they're more likely to have read Foucault than Capital.
Third example that I explore at some length in the papers has to do with McCarthyism, which was also, can be understood as a period of political correctness. Right? Now, of course, there were communists. There were national security questions. That's obvious. Right? But there was also something else. There was this process where, as progressively more anti-communist civil libertarians elected to be silent, it became ever more accurately informative of the politics of a person that they were prepared to get exercised about the methods of the House Un-American Activities Committee. What kind of people were we dealing with? These quibblers. Right? These people who are quibbling about some fine detail of civil liberties. Who are they really? Let's look. Let's take a good look. What did they write in 1935, 47? Where did they stand? These State Department eggheads who are prepared to interpret the events in China in a certain way. World historic forces at play about which we can do very little, accommodate ourselves to it, and so forth. Who are they? We get ourselves into a box. It becomes harder and harder for sensible things to be said. The methods that are being employed by the people on the march become progressively more outrageous. Nobody's saying anything. Maybe we break out of it, but it can go on for a long time. It can go on for years, and a lot of damage can be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also a social function with some of these people, too, because many of them probably would find it very difficult to socialize with others if they didn't have this stuff, like for example, I remember one time there was again before I turned off my mentions on Twitter, there was like, there must have been about like 20 to 30 guys all kind of in this, having this weird collective experience of like purging the bad person, which was me at the one time. It was so beyond any kind of anything rational, anything rooted in. These are not people who are successful who in the social world. Like, these are not people who could drop politics and still have an active social life. This is like niche subcultural online politics as a way of dealing with these absences in their own lives and stuff like that. I mean, that's very much the feeling I get about it. I don't think people have to be dogmatic Marxists or something, I don't think that at all. And I think, I'm fine with people just being idiosyncratic, which is kind of more or less what I am. I mean, I sort of collect good ideas kind of from all over the place. And I don't accept or reject things on the basis of dogma wherever possible. I always try to check myself on that. It's more like when these different figures on the left, intellectual figures that you describe, who aren't actually Marxists, end up being sort of lumped in somehow with Marxism, they at least had some kind of standards. What I'm saying is that there's always a set of correct opinions, which today everyone must have. And everyone must move in absolute lockstep with the new opinions. And, and so attitudes to sex workers have changed, attitudes on trans issues have changed. They're probably the two big ones, but attitudes on all kinds of stuff, the nature of gender, all of this stuff, like pretty fundamental, you would think, to feminism, have changed completely. But what has remained the same is that you must move in lockstep with the new ideas, or you must be purged. And the completely hysterical, like, the sense that, it's almost like a panic, like it's like a disease has sort of entered and we have to get rid of it. There's almost like this panic to get rid of this, wrong thinker from the group. It's very, very. It's such a strange phenomenon. I mean, but as I say, I mean, it has purchased on the outside world in one sense, in that these little subcultures with niche interests and who are online all day, every day, having fights, purging people and so on, they do kind of bleed out into mainstream culture a little bit somehow. Like, so, women's magazines, for example, that used to, are now starting to kind of use some of the same language that was in this obscure online world just a couple of years ago. And some of the same ideas are moving in. So that's kind of, I guess, what complicates the mainstream versus subculture thing a little bit, in that the subcultures are succeeding on the cultural issues, in kind of influencing somewhat more mainstream kind of versions of culture a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I would say that it's not a matter of the ideas changing so much, or new ideas coming up and being the dominant ones, so much as that that there's an array of ideas that you have to hold, and that they're self-contradictory often. So, and that is one of the reasons why you find such inconsistency and low standards of thought in some of these blogs, is because if you had any consistency and rigor, you would discover these problems, these contradictions, and you'd have to alter what you're saying. So what serves instead of intellectual rigor or any kind of consistency or standards of writing is a standard of tone and a standard of an approach of basically a certain kind of snarky tone and posture. There's an affect of thought and an affect of identity that you can create even with a text which is actually largely incomprehensible.
What's different about it now, I think, is the total wacky obscurity of it, and the fact that the moving in lockstep happens so much quicker now, where you can say one thing and then literally like a couple of months later, when an idea that has come into fashion in your social world, even if it completely contradicts the idea you used to hold and you used to purge people for not having, now the new idea has come in and you must purge people for not holding that one.
I just have a few of these critiques, or these claims anyway, about Kill All Normies that I thought we might go through. The first one is about this idea of a sexual hierarchy, this idea that there are a few elite men who kind of corner the market, and that they have sex with multiple partners, multiple women, and that means that there's another group of men who are deprived. You mentioned this, I think, in your book, and some people have said that you are believing this to be an absolute fact. Do you hold that that's a fact, and is there research to bear that out?
Broadly speaking, the transition from a society in which monogamy was enforced, pretty much. Of course, there were always people who secretly cheated. Of course, there were, bachelors and bachelorettes and stuff like that. But when monogamy was the norm and it was pretty rigidly enforced through kind of cultural norms, the number of sexual partners one would have were closer to the center. So you would not have a situation where, you can just go on Tinder, and if you're good looking and rich and stuff like that, you can have massive numbers of sexual partners. That would have been culturally forbidden. So it's not like, I don't know. It's almost like the critics seem to think that I was saying that there are these. Well, you see, they can't make up their minds, right? Because one minute they say, "Oh, all these alt-right guys are all celibate," until they're. I saw one recently that said guys with alt-right opinions they lose their virginity later. And that these are all kind of celibate basement dwellers and so on, right? But then if you say, well, perhaps they're a product of the fact that with the decline of monogamy, sexual competition comes to the fore, and the number of sexual partners that people have is somewhat more extreme. I mean, for example, we have seen a statistical rise in celibacy among young people. So, I mean, I just don't see that as a controversial claim. I wasn't saying, and so therefore that they've been deprived of sex and therefore they can do what they like. I mean, I was saying the opposite, actually,
The question is, in my mind anyways, is it true that women aren't facing a similar problem? Not that they would deal with it the same way, but it seems like both men and women, or boys and girls, depending on the age, I suppose, are having trouble pairing off and finding romantic lives that are satisfying, or maybe even finding a romantic partner or sexual partner at all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that chapter was about the manosphere, I'm pretty sure. It was about these online forums that are populated by men, and so it wasn't saying women. I mean, it wouldn't make any sense if women were having the same number of sexual partners and the men, it was more stratified. So I mean that's just they seem to be assuming that because there wasn't also a chapter about celibacy among women, that I was saying this was exclusive to men. It's certainly not.
Okay, great. Do you think that you should have spent more time refuting alt-right ideas in your book?
I think that a book refuting alt-right ideas would be great. But, there's a remarkable lack of interest in articles and things like that refuting alt-right ideas. And that's very interesting to me. Like, the funny thing is that the kind of people who are most enraged by the book on the left, will say, or the whatever internet cultural left, they're the people who say, oh, no, you shouldn't engage with their ideas because that's debating Nazis. And, so I've suggested loads of times to people, do you think we should kind of try to just like take claim by claim and just like try to actually first refute them and then present an alternative, like approach to the same problem? And I have been generally met with either indifference or something about how we shouldn't debate Nazis, we shouldn't engage with their ideas in any way, or editors just going, no, I don't think so. So people want these kind of these like little style features on what the alt-right, what their haircut means, or like, after Charlottesville, I was like inundated with requests from journalists going, oh, I want to write something about Kekistan and, all this kind of stuff. And like, even though my book was about all that minutia kind of in a way, I kind of felt this is serious now. And we actually do have to directly confront their ideas and try to engage with them. But I think that in order to do that effectively, you would be necessarily forced to step outside of the realm of absolutely safe, correct internet opinion. You would have to, when I think of who could do it, I think of, I'm not sure that there are many people on the left who could, because these are big kind of civilizational questions. And as I said, you know, you'd have to kind of get your hands dirty quite a bit to really get into them. But I would love to write more pieces refuting the particular claims and ideas. I think what the critics of the book really wanted, because the critics of the book are the people who are saying we shouldn't be engaging with their ideas at all because that will involve taking them seriously. I think what the critics who said that kind of thing wanted was for me to condemn them morally more.
This particular question came from a review in These Times, which was mostly praise. So there was no condemnation in that review.
Yeah.
So this question isn't coming from that direction. It was just, and you've answered the question really well, I think.
Yeah, I mean that particular review was very good, and that reviewer was correct, because what he was saying was we need more engagement with our ideas. I completely agree with that. I want to see that. I would love to get people to not just myself, but to get people who are much more knowledgeable than me in different areas to do that. I've actually been kind of racking my brain trying to think of how I can find a way to do that, to get kind of the really good people together to try to really nail these ideas. But again, it's kind of been met with not a lot of enthusiasm in the publishing world.
I can see why, because if you do publish such a book, you could very well be accused of giving these ideas a platform.
Exactly.
You know, I suggested on YouTube that I would like to interview Nick Land and really go to town on him and kind of spell out how Deleuze connects to his eventual like race realism, figure that out. And I thought it would be useful for people on the left to see how someone like Nick Land can move from being a supposedly radical leftist to being a figure for the alt-right. And I was, of course, immediately accused of giving Nick Land, wanting to give Nick Land a platform, even though it was going to be an adversarial interview, if it happened. The last question here is about cultural transgression. And obviously a big part of your book is that it's a call to move away from cultural politics and to more economic and material politics. But do you think that cultural transgression is ever a powerful political strategy, or could be today?
It is still a very dominant part of our culture. Like we inherited it from the Romantics, I guess. I mean, so it is still a kind of cultural mode, or maybe even sort of value system that is still pretty dominant. So it does still have power. I mean, I guess what I was saying was more, or what I feel certainly now, what I think more is like, I was questioning whether it actually has value, like not whether it can, have an effect, but whether it is something that has value in and of itself. For example, why I ended up kind of talking about that was that I noticed early on in discussions of 4chan. So I would go on 4chan and I would look and see misogyny and racism and really extreme cruelty and dehumanization of people. That was absolutely standard. There was no sudden cultural, or there was no sudden political turn to the right on 4chan, in my opinion. I think it was rooted in cruelty and that constant kind of transgression of moral boundaries and boundaries of propriety and so on. And so that's what I was trying to explain, I suppose, with that people who are leftish, will say progressives, whatever you want to call it, naturally tend to think that kind of transgressive style must be in some way progressive, or must be in some way in line with their own kind of politics. But, my point was, this is just as, this can just as easily express the ideas of the far right, so therefore we shouldn't regard it as something innately progressive or good. It just is kind of. And also, I think that it leads us to a bigger discussion about the difference between critiquing, smashing, destroying, taking down institutions, showing the bankruptcy of institutions and destroying them, the difference between all of that and building. So I think that the work, the left has been brilliant at critiquing things that needed to be critiqued, being subversive, turning the world upside down, and kind of questioning things and all that stuff, which and so many institutions which had too much power were questioned by the left, and that's great. The problem is that the much more difficult thing, which hasn't really been done to the same extent, is the actual building an alternative. So, for example, nationalism is considered right wing, and it has been critiqued as just a kind of a social construct and so on. Gender, sexuality, race, all of these things critiqued in terms of showing something to be a social construct, and therefore essentially undermining its relevance or its meaning in the world. The nuclear family, marriage, like all the church, all this kind of stuff. So the problem. So then what you have is, what remains after that? And if you look around today at this total desert kind of that the alt-right has come from, and that it's no coincidence that millennials are the ones who are being attracted to the alt-right. What we have left over is actually this weird fusion of anti-social kind of individualism of Thatcher and the absence of all of these, the absence of institutions, essentially. And what remains then is this very individualized, very atomized world in which many people don't have a sense that their lives are meaningful, that they can have a collective identity, that they can be part of a collective project that is inspiring. And really it's this very extreme form of total individualism and total atomization. And I think that is just not enough to sustain people. It is, obviously people, many people are very unhappy, with that. And I just think that we need to focus perhaps more on what replaces those things, what replaces the church, what replaces nation, what replaces the family. We say like, oh, we replace the family with, the village raising the child or whatever, but the reality is that the actual reality of that is that you have a lot of very isolated people raising children in very isolated circumstances. Again, I'm not saying, oh, we have to return to some sort of like Catholic sort of like 3 generations living in a one house kind of situation. Like, obviously not. But that's the way we have to be thinking. We have to be thinking about community, about belonging, about purpose, collective purpose, unless you're a radical kind of individualist, which I'm not.
Well, I can't help but think about the first half of our conversation where we were talking about how the reaction to your book has largely been one of identity formation and trying to gain membership and maintain membership within a subculture. And it seems like these little enclaves online, these subcultural spaces, are attempts to forge some sort of collective identity to support the individual. That's their sociological and psychological function.
But they're so small, though. I mean,
I'm not saying they're good. I'm not saying they're adequate. I'm just saying that it's sort of this symptomatic reaction that sort of justifies. I think that the reaction to your book proves out its argument that we really are in dire need of much better, more rational and thought out and truly equitable kind of society and ways for people to have collective identities.
Yeah, and I also think that this is part of the Bernie and Corbyn phenomenon. I remember actually, both of them have in different ways been disparaged by some on the left as like old-fashioned, like left conservative sort of. I've heard that like accusation, and I think it is interesting that all of these like millennials being attracted to, it's almost like uncovering, like they're uncovering this old world that existed before the Thatcher and Reagan kind of destruction of everything.
Yeah, well, I mean, look at Jordan Peterson's success. You know, it's all about his promise to bring you back into the family in a way, but into a culture that he claims still exists and that we need to protect, right? Into a collective identity.
Another thing about Jordan Peterson's appeal, I think, is I've heard him say things like, you know, go to the library, like to young students. I mean, particularly male students, they seem to be who was kind of like crowding around him. And he was saying like, forget this stuff. Just spend all your time in the library, read, and become articulate. And one of the things that he was saying was like, being articulate gives you power. Honing your ideas and kind of being exposed to lots of ideas gives you this kind of power. That in a way should be a sort of obvious message. Like telling students to go to the library shouldn't be a particularly weird or kind of radical message, but I could see like why it kind of inspired younger people who perhaps feel that they're trapped in this world where they're kind of cast out, if you like, right, for not having liberal opinions or whatever it might be, and that instead they can go into the library and sort of bury themselves sort of uncover this world that existed before that, and that they would be able to, that there is this kind of world of ideas out there that you can access. And I can see why people responded well to that.
Well, I think having access to a world of ideas necessitates there being a world. That necessitates that, these ideas can exist not just in your head, but they can be held by others and explored and understood and debated amongst people who share a collective identity. That you need that in order to have, like, again and again when I talk to people about the issue of free speech, what it comes down to is a profound mistrust of the people that they'll be debating. That there's no commitment to the idea of creating a community in which uncomfortable ideas can be debated, because there's no collective identity to do that around. I think these things go hand in hand. One last question. Horseshoe theory. What's your stance on it? Are you big into that idea? Are you an advocate of horseshoe theory?
No, I mean, one of the problems. I mean, I've actually seen some people, in sort of offended Twitter world saying, "Oh, she's blaming the left for the right," and this kind of stuff. Again, that you can only reach that conclusion if you think that these weird internet subcultures are the left. I don't think they are. I mean, if you had to put them either on the right or left, yes, they would be on the left. But they are just one tiny little speck sort of in the left. So no, I think that the idea that the left and the right are basically the same. Shows the weakness of the center in a way. They're remarkably weak at the moment, like in terms of they're not really able to figure out what their project is. And all they can say is sort of, oh, there's just extremists everywhere and they're all the same. But the thing is, there is one important respect in which I think that the left and the right are both in very different ways and with very different outcomes, addressing the aftermath of, decades of the destruction of all institutions, the destruction of any kind of collective society, the destruction of society essentially, and this horrible thing that remains, which is just pure atomization and individualism. I think that the right and the left are both kind of addressing that, and they're addressing it, they're speaking to it, in other words. And so that doesn't mean they're the same at all. It just means that they're both able to see that this is a problem, and they're kind of able to tap into kind of like that feeling that people have of having lost kind of society, essentially, or any kind of collective goals. So, for example, Bernie talks a lot about kind of community and solidarity, and his whole language is about, it's almost a communitarian sort of a left communitarian sort of language of his age. I mean, he has that from the devastating Reagan and Thatcher years. Like he's actually carried it through his whole life. And he's almost like, for very young people, he's almost like this relic of the past before everything was kind of destroyed. And so people look to him and yeah, that language of collective goals and solidarity and stuff really, really appeals, I think, to millennials in particular. Some older people are completely baffled by the popularity of these old guys with young people. But also on the right are asking those big collective kind of questions. So the right, I mean, one of the things that the alt-right has really tapped into is they have rejected the kind of pro-free market individualism of the establishment right. And that is, I think, part of their appeal also. They are saying to young they're saying to millennials, actually you're a part of this big story. You're part of a collective, if you join this collective project, you join this sort of family, you are, you're something more than just an individual acting on your own. And again, this is not saying they're the same. It's saying with totally different outcomes in mind and coming from a totally different place, the reason why you're seeing what the center regard as this kind of extreme politics, the rise of the right and the left, is because the center is not in any way speaking to those problems, and it's just trying to kind of repackage and just repeat this very weak tea kind of liberal individualism. And I think we've had enough of it, and people clearly are longing for something else, I think.